Hi, I'm Josh, and I am so grateful you've chosen to spend some of your very valuable time with me as I talk about the board games that I played in the month of August 2023. So I'm glad you're here with me, even though I didn't take the time to look particularly nice for you, didn't raise the hawk or bother to shave or anything. And truth be told, I was looking at some of my most recent blood work results earlier. I noticed that both my cholesterol and my level of kidney disease have gotten worse since the last time it was all checked. So I've been feeling a little bummed out, not super motivated to really spend time on my physical appearance. But to leave that behind and move on to something else that's a real bummer, I only got a total of 9 unique games played in the month of August, and that is largely due to my financial situation. Not to keep banging away at that issue, but it has been having a significant impact on my ability to play games, and that is partly due to the fact that Paul and I used to take turns going to each other's houses to play games, although he would come here to play more often than I would go to him. However, there were times where I would go to his house to play, and now in the somewhat crisis mode I'm in with the current interest rates and costs of living and all that going through the roof, I just can't afford to put gas in my car, so I really have to leave my car parked unless I need to run a local errand, like get my kids off to school or go to the grocery store or anything like that. I certainly can't make the 45-minute drive each way to get to Paul's and incur that gas cost plus putting wear and tear on the car and all that nonsense. So unfortunately, I need to have my friends come to me if I want to play in-person games. Now, you would think that that would be less time consuming for me, but it's actually more time consuming, because if I invite a friend over to play, I want to make sure that the main floor of my house and the bathrooms are all very tidy and clean. I want to make sure I have some fresh baked goods to have on hand for the game day. I have to, of course, make sure that I've learned the rules to all the games that we want to play. I'll take the time to set them all up nicely, and then when the gaming day is over, I'll take the time to put it all away neatly and pack it all up in such a way that it'll be easy to take out again when we play next time. And so all of this is a very time-consuming process. It would be much easier for me to hop in my car, put on a podcast on my phone, and just enjoy a drive to and from my friend's place, wherever I happen to be gaming, but I instead have to put in this extra time and have people come to me. Of course, I enjoy this. I really love having people here to play games, and I'm really quite happy to host. I do miss Paul's cat, especially little Fred running up to greet me every time I come in by to visit there, and I also miss being able to detour to the Mississauga Krispy Kreme store to get a little box of cream-filled donuts for us to enjoy while we're playing, because we have none of that around here, and again, I just can't afford to go out and buy treats like that anymore. So that is a bit of a bummer. But I will say, though, that I am more grateful than ever to my Patreon supporters for helping me get through each month, especially to my higher tier supporters, Saver Girl, Abe O, and Mojo Dam, and my even higher tier supporter, Joanna, and my highest tier supporter, Asmanis Perfect. You're all making a genuine difference in my life at this point. And as humiliating as it is to ask for money, I will say, if you can't afford just $2 a month, please do check out my Patreon page and consider supporting me there. If a whole bunch of you just pledge for $2 a month, that would really take quite a massive load off my back. So if you're able to, please do check it out. And if you are unable to, or just don't feel like it, that's totally legit too. You can support me by just subscribing to the channel. That's another way you can support me without spending any money. So putting all the negative stuff behind us now and getting on to the fun, let me just say that one good thing about the 9 games that were played this month is they were all good games. There were no turds played in the month of August. So let's get on to talking about some really fun board games. As usual, I'm going to go through these 9 games in order of my lowest rated game to my highest rated game, and we're starting off with a game that I think was new to me this month, and that is a game called Honshu. And the reason why I think it's new to me is there are 3 or 4 games that are very similar to each other that involve collecting cards and then playing those cards in a tableau in front of you where you can partially overlap other cards to build up a map of sorts. So with Honshu, there is kind of a drafting phase where you acquire new cards and then you use those cards to build them in such a way as to combine the different elements on the cards. Each card is divided up into 6 terrain types, and you're trying to build them in such a way as to either have them near similar terrain types or arranged in such a way that they're going to score points. So if you're familiar with games such as the older game Suburbia, for instance, where you're scoring points by getting your buildings arranged in certain patterns, or the newer game Acropolis is another example where you have several different building types where you get points based on how you build them, Honshu is very much along similar lines where the different terrain types give you points based on how you build them. In terms of the two parts to the game, the drafting part to acquire the cards and then the building part to take the cards you've acquired and build them on the table in front of you, I'm not sure if the drafting element works very well in this game. I felt like there were some issues and awkwardness with the drafting part, and I really don't know how much impact it has on the overall game, but the actual building part of it was very fun. It turns out both Paul and I really enjoy spatial puzzles, so being able to take patterns and arrange them in the most optimal manner is a lot of fun for both of us. So I ended up rating Honshu 6.5 out of 10, and Paul rates it 7 out of 10. Next is another new to me game called Lands of Galzir, and in this instance, an extremely generous viewer of my channel essentially sent me the money to be able to purchase the full deluxe edition of Lands of Galzir that comes with this nice playmat and extra dice and some other nice upgraded components. And this is very much a storytelling game that is designed by the same team that created Dawn of Peacemakers, which actually has a second edition that is either still on Kickstarter or recently ended on Kickstarter. So they're coming out with a newer edition of Dawn of Peacemakers. But this viewer saw how much I personally enjoyed Dawn of Peacemakers, even though the people that I tried to play it with didn't enjoy it nearly as much as I did. So I kind of had to put it on the for sale pile. Lands of Galzir has a very similar, wonderful art style with this beautiful natural world and animal characters that you're playing as. And what's interesting about it is you can play it cooperatively by everybody collecting as many points as possible together, or you can play it as a competitive game where you're trying to end up with the most points at the end of each game. And the game really doesn't change regardless of whether you play it cooperatively or competitively, other than if you play cooperatively, you're trying to basically get as many points as possible to see how that affects the story. Now, this whole genre of storytelling board games has been one that I've struggled with because I personally love narrative in games. I love games where I feel like I am creating a story, even if it's not overtly reading paragraphs from a book. If I'm telling a story through my play, then it is more meaningful to me in terms of what I'm doing on the board, as opposed to something purely abstract. And so going back to the very early days of this genre, with a game like Tales of the Arabian Nights, for instance, way back when they re-released Tales of the Arabian Nights in its newer edition, I tried that game and just did not enjoy it at all. It was basically one random event after another, totally unconnected random event after another, and it felt like each decision you made had also totally random results. You could feel like that you made the best choice for whatever encounter was happening, but the result could be either very good or very bad, and that had nothing to do with the choice it made so much as just whatever the result happened to be. And so because there was no connection with the overall story from encounter in that game, I just didn't enjoy Tales of the Arabian Nights. And then Ryan Lockett came along and started to combine this storytelling reading paragraphs element with more Euro-style board game mechanisms. And so way back when Above and Below came out, I thought that was a pretty neat game because it had a solid gameplay, but at the same time it had kind of interesting storytelling elements, even though once again there wasn't necessarily an overarching overarching plot or story taking place. It was more kind of one encounter after another. It was still an interesting game to play. However, the more I explored the Red Raven games from Ryan Lockett, such as Near and Far, for instance, I found that Near and Far was more heavily focused on the story, and the gameplay itself in Near and Far I just thought was pretty boring and uninspiring. And unfortunately, the more I played these games, I realized the writing quality just was not very high. You'll hear people use phrases like, oh, it's good writing for a board game. And I'm like, no, I'm not willing to settle for a board game. I'm an avid reader and I love a good story with great writing. And there's no reason why, if a publisher is creating a storytelling game, they shouldn't hire a professional writer who can do good writing for the game. So for me, Near and Far failed both in the gameplay and the storytelling. Now, when Lands of Galzir got to the table finally, I found its system of storytelling very interesting. It comes with hundreds of cards. Most of the gameplay is built around cards, and you do have a game board, a map of this world you're running around in and interacting with. And the cities on the board, though, you place cards to show what's currently available to be explored in each city, and those cards can be switched out as you interact with and change the things that are available to do in the city. In addition to that, as you collect a quest and work through it, as you complete the events of one card, you're going to draw another card and continue that quest through a series of different encounters. And along with all of that, you have an actual app that comes with the game that takes you through the story step by step as you make your choices about how to interact with each encounter, and as you roll dice to apply your skills to what is happening to see in which direction the story goes from there. So with Lands of Galzir, I enjoyed the storytelling. I thought the writing was good. It wasn't really great, but it was good enough that I was able to enjoy the storytelling elements. In terms of the gameplay, you're really not making very many compelling decisions as you work through your quests and your adventures. You're more or less deciding which quests you're going to focus on and where you're going to go to advance those quests. And then when you have specific encounters, it'll often give you a couple of choices of how to deal with that encounter. Do you want to use your explore ability to look around, or do you want to use more your strength and your might to deal more forcefully with a situation? Each character has, I think, 6 different stats and 3 levels of each stat. So you're good in some areas and weaker in others. And so most of the decision making involves basically trying to use your best stats to deal with each situation, unless there's an instance where you decide, no, I don't necessarily want to use my best stat because it's not how I want to deal with the situation. Then you might choose a weaker stat. And from there, you're just rolling dice to see how many successes you get and how well you perform your tasks. So there's not really much in the way of compelling decision making, and it is very much focused on progressing the story and finding out what happens next. So the storytelling aspect of the game is very much the core focus of the game. I will say that I think the biggest negative we ran into with Lands of Galzir is that the playtime is long. So I believe that each game has 5 days or 5 rounds where each of the players around the table are going to have a turn to basically move and then have a series of encounters, and the next player will do the same, and you'll go 5 times around the table in that manner. And our first game with 4 players, I played with myself, my 2 boys, and Paul. And with the rules explanation and then kind of introducing our characters and starting with our opening quests and playing through the first 3 days of the game, we didn't even get through all 5 days of the first game. It took us more than 3 hours just to get through those first 3 days as we were kind of initially starting out our quests. Now that's because the first turn is longer as you kind of get introduced to your character and what their story is and what their motivations are. But it took us 2 play sessions to get through just the first game, and after the first play session my older boy dropped out because he wasn't having as much fun with it as he would have liked. And in fact, in our first game, in that game that took over 3 hours, both my boys were getting so antsy and to the point where at one point I just had to walk away from the table, just let everybody reset for 10 minutes, and then come back with a more focused mindset and get back into the game again. So for the boys, it was a lot of just kind of sitting around twiddling their thumbs, and they weren't as interested as I was in listening to other player stories and what the characters were doing. In fact, I think I was the only one at the table who was really invested with everybody's story and what was happening to everybody. I think the other players were just kind of waiting around half an hour for their turn to come around again, or whatever, however long it took. So like I said, my older son Evan dropped out after the first game, after the first play. After the second play, when we finally completed game one, Paul decided that it really wasn't the game for him anymore. So if I do go forward with the game, it'll be with just me and Wyatt. Yes, you can play the game solo. However, I'm just not a solo game player. I mean, even with this game where you're not really interacting with your other characters much at all, you're just kind of trying to follow through with your own story. If it comes down to it, I would just rather pick up a book and read a great book than play through a solo storytelling game on my own, I think. So, unfortunately, much like Dawn of Peacemakers, Lanes of Galzier turns out to be a game that I enjoy more than anybody else I've played it with. Overall, I did rate the game 7 out of 10. Paul rates it only a 4 out of 10, but he wanted to emphasize that that's not so much a problem with the game as it is just being not a good fit for the style of play he enjoys. His words were, it's a cool design, but not for me. So the game design he thought was really well done, but, you know, just being a specific fit in terms of his own enjoyment, he just didn't really find that it hit his sweet spot. So that's Lanes of Galzier, a game that I think is very well designed in terms, I mean, I could go into just this amazing card system and how the game progresses and changes over time just by swapping out cards or progressing to the next event, and how the world changes as you interact with it. And one thing I didn't mention is the fact that there's no real endpoint to the game. There's no overall big quest that you're trying to work towards. You're just people living in this open sandbox world, and you're living your lives and going out and doing quests and having adventures. And at some point, you will probably have seen most of what the game has to offer over the course of many, many plays with these hundreds of cards. And at that point, you might go, yeah, I guess I'm pretty much finished with the game here. But it's just very much an open world for you to go out exploring in, and I love that. I enjoy this really unique aspect of not having a specific campaign that works towards a specific goal, but it just gives you a playground to go out and have adventures in, and I just think that's wonderful. I think that's such a really cool design, and it's really well done. But it's probably best played with 2 to 3 players who just want to sit down and explore it and tell interesting stories. And now we'll move on to Cascadia. This is a game that I used to own, and I was going to put it in the last board game auction that Paul and I did together, but Paul said that he was interested in the game, so I just gave it to him. So it was my game. Now it's Paul's game. And when I went over to Paul's house last time, we ended up taking it out and playing it again. This one is a very abstract, thinky, highly tactical game. I think it was a Spiel des Jahres Game of the Year winner, although I only rate it 7 out of 10. Paul rates it 8.5 out of 10, so this is a game that he enjoys a lot, and I think it's cool. I enjoy playing it every so often, but it's not my favorite. Next is a game called Steam that I played on Steam. I think the full name of the game is Steam Rails to Riches, and I played it on the computer platform Steam. I had previously played this game in digital format on my phone, and like I mentioned in the month of July games, I ended up purchasing Steam during the Steam summer sale, and so I got it on my computer, and you know, I actually had sold my huge copy of Railways of the World and all the expansions I had for it, thinking that because I had enjoyed playing Steam on my phone, it seemed like a more streamlined, kind of stripped down version that would be easier to get to the table if I were to ever pick up a physical copy of it than Railways of the World. However, when I played it again on the computer, I realized, yeah, it's a really good game. I enjoyed it quite a bit. And it does have some advantages over Railways of the World. For instance, it is more streamlined, and I like that there is both a track build and cube delivery on every single player turn, whereas in Railways of the World, you have to decide whether you want to spend your actions to build tracks or to deliver cubes, or however you want to split up your turns. But I also remembered some irritations I had back when I played on the phone, and that is the fact that the AI players tended to beat me by building these railway connections that just went in endless loops and loops and loops so that they could upgrade their train engine and do lots of deliveries in a single turn for lots of points. But the optimal way to build tracks to get points in this game is completely nonsensical in terms of kind of a real world rail line. So whereas in a game like Railways of the World, you're usually building long routes and connections to connect all over the map to be able to transport cubes over long distances to get lots of points. And this game is more about curling through loops and loops in small areas to get those points. And I don't like that nearly as much for whatever reason. I also don't like that, whereas in Railways of the World, the game ends just when you feel like, oh, I just wish I had maybe 1 or 2 more turns to do a couple more deliveries. Steam ends too late. So you are kind of struggling to figure out how to maybe get 1 more cube delivered in the final turn. You've pretty much done it all already because you have a hard limit of a level 6 train that you can build up to, and then from that you're just trying to find as many long deliveries to make as possible, and it feels like the game goes on a little bit too long. It should end maybe a turn sooner than it does. So after selling my Railways of the World, I realized I actually like that game better than Steam. Fortunately, as I'll talk about in a minute, there is a bit of a solution to that. Next, Paul and I played, I think in the month of August, we actually played 6 more games of My City, or in other words, 2 more chapters, because each chapter is made up of 3 pretty short games. My City is Reiner Knizia's polyomino shapes building legacy game where you're making permanent alterations to the game as you progress by adding stickers and bringing new elements into the game and so forth. Paul and I are both really enjoying this game still. We want to play it every single time we get together. I rate it 8 out of 10. Paul also rates it 8 out of 10. Now, unfortunately though, I found myself down 14 points to 4 after 9 games of the overall campaign. So as you play through the campaign, you are accumulating points so that at the end of these 8 chapters or 24 gameplays, whoever has the most points is going to be the overall winner of the legacy campaign. And yeah, like I said, after 9 games, I was down 14 points to 4, and I just don't know if there's a good enough catch-up mechanism built into the play for me to have really any chance of coming out with a victory by the end of our 24th game. And this is actually one problem I had with the Stonemaier legacy game Charterstone, is I found myself and one other player in our 4-player campaign both got behind very early in that campaign, and we just really never felt like we had a chance of catching up from there. It was kind of the same 2 players winning game after game. And as you'll see for my September game plays, I did finally get a couple of wins under my belt at least, but for the most part I don't feel like there's any real meaningful way for me to catch up in the game. Now, of course, I'm not a competitive person. My enjoyment of the game isn't based on how often I win the game or not. So I'm certainly having a ton of fun playing this game still. But there is that certain element of frustration where I wish I was a little more competitive in the campaign. Now, getting back to our railroads, I was just talking about Railways of the World, and that time that I was at Paul's house, we pulled out his copy of Railways of Mexico, which is one of the expansions of Railways of the World. As I mentioned in my Games Played in July video, I got to play Railways of the World on Board Game Arena with one of my viewers, and I mentioned how it was just so fun to get back to one of my all-time favorite games and think with regret how I don't own it anymore. But the Railways of the Mexico map is a great map for 2 players because it's a fairly narrow, small map. that is more interactive for two players playing together on the map. Of course, playing this game in the physical form was way better than playing it on Board Game Arena. It's just one of those games that has big, chunky, satisfying components to handle, and that wonderful tactile element that you get with physical board games. I rated Railways of Mexico 8.5 out of 10, and Paul rated it 9 out of 10, and it was just so fun to get back to an old favorite. And getting back to old favorites applies to the last 3 games on the list, which I'll go through pretty quickly because I've talked about all 3 of them quite a bit in the past. We have next K2 with the Lotzi expansion, which is the most recent expansion I picked up in the month of July. You'll know if you watch my previous videos just how much I enjoy K2 as being a very simple yet incredibly tension-filled game. The Lotzi expansion specifically adds a ropes element where you can make your own pathways up the mountain, which is really cool. And it also has this really wide mountain that's divided up into 3 weather sectors so that the inclement weather affects different parts of the mountain in different ways, which is also another unique aspect of the expansion. And as with previous expansions like Broad Peak, the reverse side of the board has a very small but very fast mountain that you can play through much more quickly because you have to actually remove a few cards before you start the game. It's a shorter, quicker, much more intense. Well, the entire game is pretty intense, but it's definitely a quicker play if you want to knock off a faster game of K2. So, love K2. I rate it 9 out of 10. I don't know if I asked Paul about his rating of Lotzi. It's probably the same as his previous ratings of K2, which I'll put on the screen here. I didn't write down on my notes. But moving along to another campaign in which I'm getting absolutely crushed by Paul, we have Battles of Westeros again. Yet again, I was smoked and taken out of the game with an instant loss condition, but at that point I was down 11 victory points to 2, so even if the game had gone the full length, there's no way I would have won it. And yeah, I keep getting absolutely smashed in Battles of Westeros, and I was thinking about that, and part of it is due to my kind of overall gaming strategy in comparison to Paul's, and this is an exaggeration just to make a point, but basically I go into a game like Battles of Westeros with this full send strategy where I'm like, all right, I got my armies, let's go, Leroy Jenkins, and I just charge forward and cause mayhem, whereas Paul is much more methodical and thinks through the best way to plan each move and is much more cautious about how he advances and goes for objectives and that sort of thing. And so I ended up walking into trouble and getting crushed. And I think that's kind of an overall philosophy to games in general, where I think, this looks fun, I'm going to do that. Whereas Paul's like, let's see, how can I min-max this opportunity and get the most out of it? And of course he ends up winning. And, you know, it's just how we both enjoy our games, and that's cool. I got no problem with that. I think if I actually cared more about winning, I'd probably put a little more thought into what I was doing. But like I said, this is all an exaggeration. I do, of course, do my best, and I do think through each turn and do actually try to win the game. So, you know, I'm exaggerating a bit, but that's kind of one way where I run into a bit of trouble. Of course, Paul's also extremely smart, and there's that aspect too, of course. I rate Battles of Westeros 9 out of 10, and Paul rates it 8 out of 10, so we're both enjoying it a ton. So, going on to my number 1 game of the month of August, we got back yet again to Spirit Island. Now, unfortunately, here's where things went wrong for us in terms of trying to play it through Steam on our computers, because, like I said, I haven't been able to go to his place to play games as much. We've been trying to make up for that by playing more online, and so we got back to Spirit Island again and tried to play it remotely through Steam, and it's frozen on us twice out of the, I think, 3 times we've tried to play Spirit Island on Steam. So we've essentially given up attempting to play this particular game on Steam. And so I would say that if you're thinking about purchasing the digital form of this game on Steam, if you're only going to be playing it solo, it works very well as a solo game. I've played a bunch of solo games, and I did again in the month of August play another solo game after it failed to work for the 2 of us, and it went great. But I would not get Spirit Island on Steam if you're getting it to play remotely with 1 or more other players, because it just doesn't seem to work. It's a flippin' amazing game, however, and I rate it 9 out of 10. Paul rates it 8.5 out of 10. And that's it for my month of August. Please get down in the comments and tell me about your recent board gaming. What have you been getting to the table? What have you been enjoying lately? Are there any upcoming games, maybe some upcoming Essen releases that you're super excited to check out? You know I absolutely love to hear about all that. Please do let me know. I'd love to chat with you some more, and I'd love it if you would subscribe to my channel and give me a quick thumb up as you go on your way out the door here. Cheers. As usual, I'm going to go through these 9 games in order. It's as so that they can upgrade their build to. This is Reiner Knedi that you can play through in a much quicker. They can. Are there any upcoming